Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so buckle up, because this deep dive is a big one. We're going deep into Freedom Summer and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I think a lot of people, they hear those terms and they think, oh yeah, I learned about that in history class. But
Right.
there's so much more to it. There's so many layers.
Absolutely. And I think to really appreciate it, you have to understand just how bad things were, right? Like how deeply ingrained these injustices were against Black Americans, particularly in the South.
Yeah, and we're talking about basic rights here. We're not even talking about, like, equality in every aspect of life. We're talking about just basic rights to vote, to, participate in society.
Absolutely. And, it's the early 1960s. The civil rights movement is gaining steam. But you've got these organizations like the NAACP, CORE, SNCC. They're realizing this isn't just a fight that's going to be won with speeches.
Right.
They have to put in the work on the ground.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't just talk about it. You have to go out and make the change. And so these groups are really on the front lines of that. And what kinds of things are they doing? I mean, what does that look like, that on the ground work?
So you have to imagine for a second that just the act of registering to vote could cost you your job, your safety, even your life.
Wow.
I mean, that's how high the stakes were.
Yeah, that's something that's so hard for, I think, a lot of us to wrap our heads around, like that was the reality for so many people.
It was a system designed to keep Black Americans from exercising their rights.
And they did it in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't just like, oh, we're going to physically stop you from voting. There were a lot of almost like sneaky ways to do it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, take literacy tests, for example.
Right.
They would give these tests that were often deliberately confusing, even for people who, were highly educated. And they were used specifically to disqualify Black voters.
So even though, the 15th Amendment had been passed and it was supposed to, guarantee the right to vote regardless of race, they found these other ways to get around it.
Exactly. They found ways to circumvent the law. And it wasn't just literacy tests. You had poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all sorts of things.
Wow. So it's like this constant battle. They make a little bit of progress, and then there's this, pushback, and they have to find another way around.
Exactly. It was a constant struggle. And then you have this major event that shakes the nation. JFK is assassinated in November of 1963.
Yeah, November 63.
And you would think that something like that would completely derail the fight for civil rights.
Right, because you've lost this champion of, at least in word, if not in action fully yet. But
right.
He was speaking to these things, and it seemed like he was an ally, at least.
He was making it part of the national conversation, and then suddenly he's gone, and you have LBJ Johnson, who's now president.
Yeah.
And Johnson, he's a seasoned politician. He understands the gravity of this situation, but he also sees an opportunity to use this moment, this national mourning, to push for the Civil Rights Act.
Interesting. So he sees this tragedy, and he's like, all right, we need to seize this moment.
Absolutely. He recognizes that the nation is paying attention, and he's not going to let this opportunity slip away.
But I imagine that wasn't a very popular move with everyone, right? I mean,
Oh, absolutely not.
you're talking about some pretty major changes here.
This was a huge deal. And you have to remember, the South was a very different place back then.
Right, of course.
And Southern Democrats, many of whom relied on the very systems of segregation that the Civil Rights Act was trying to dismantle, they were ready for a fight.
So they're going to do everything they can to stop this.
Oh, absolutely. They're going to fight this tooth and nail.
It's hard to even imagine, the atmosphere, the tension in the air that something like this is being debated.
Oh, it was incredibly contentious. I mean, you have to remember, this was a time of massive social upheaval, and the Civil Rights Act was really at the heart of it.
Yeah, this is a huge deal, and you've got these Southern senators who are absolutely determined to kill this bill, to stop it dead in its tracks.
Oh, they were pulling out all the stops, and one of their favorite tactics was the filibuster.
Ah, the filibuster. For those who maybe slept through that day in history class, explain what that is.
So basically, a filibuster is when a senator or a group of senators, they just keep talking
Right.
for hours and hours and hours on end, all to prevent a vote from happening.
So they can just talk about anything. It doesn't even have to be related to the bill.
Well, it's supposed to be related, but they can get pretty creative.
I bet.
And the thing is, they can't just stop talking. They have to keep going, or else they lose the floor.
Wow, so it's like a physical endurance test almost.
It really is. And they would use all sorts of tactics to stay awake and keep going.
Like what do they do?
Well, they'd have coffee and food brought to them. They'd do stretches. Some would even have staffers rub their shoulders to keep them going.
Oh my gosh, that's wild.
And the longest filibuster on record against the Civil Rights Act lasted for over 50 days. Can you believe that?
50 days. That's insane. I mean, just the thought of someone talking for 50 days straight makes my throat hurt.
Right. It's unbelievable. And they were doing everything they could to prevent a vote on basic human rights. I mean, that's what's so astounding about it.
So LBJ's facing this uphill battle. He's got this opposition that's literally willing to talk themselves to death to stop this bill. What's his next move?
Well, LBJ, he's a shrewd politician, right?
Right.
He's not just going to sit back and let this happen.
Right.
He knows he needs to find a way to outmaneuver them, and he also knows he needs to build a coalition. He needs to get enough votes to overcome this opposition.
So it becomes a numbers game?
To some extent, yes, but it's also about strategy, about finding the right people to sway, to make deals with, to apply pressure to...
And who does he see as key to getting this done?
Well, there's one figure who really stands out, and that's Senator Everett Dirksen.
Dirksen. Now, he was a Republican, right?
He was, and a very conservative one at that, so not someone you'd necessarily expect to be a champion of civil rights.
Right.
But Dirksen, he was a complex figure, and he surprised a lot of people with his stance on this issue.
So he's open to hearing LBJ out on this.
He is, and I think part of it was just he recognized the moral imperative of the Civil Rights Act.
He sees that this is bigger than just politics.
Exactly. This is about right and wrong, about basic human dignity.
And so LBJ is able to bring him on board. How does he manage that?
Well, it wasn't easy. There were a lot of conversations, a lot of back and forth, but ultimately, LBJ was able to appeal to Dirksen's sense of justice, to his belief in fairness.
And this is where those political skills that LBJ was known for, they really come into play, right?
Oh, absolutely. LBJ was a master negotiator. He knew how to work a room, how to find common ground, even with people who seemed like they were on completely opposite sides of an issue.
And so Dirksen agrees to help push the Civil Rights Act through the Senate, but he's just one man. Can he really make a difference?
Well, he's one very influential man, and his support gives cover to other Republicans who might have been hesitant to support such a sweeping piece of legislation.
So it's like a domino effect.
In a way, yes. And Dirksen himself, he delivers this incredibly impassioned speech on the Senate floor, urging his colleagues to let us perfect the dream.
Oh, wow. I love that. Let us perfect the dream.
Right. It was a powerful moment, and it really helped to sway some of the undecided voters.
So finally, after all this back and forth, all this political maneuvering, the Civil Rights Act, it passes.
It does. On July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed into law by President Johnson.
Wow. What a moment. I mean, it's hard to overstate the significance of that, right?
It was a landmark achievement, a testament to the tireless work of countless activists and the political will of leaders like LBJ and Dirksen.
And it finally outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.
Right. It was a major step forward for civil rights, but as we'll see, the fight was far from over.
So the Civil Rights Act, it's law, but like you said, the fight's not over, not by a long shot.
Not even close, because passing a law is one thing, right? Enforcing it, changing hearts and minds, that's a whole other battle.
And that's where we see this incredible movement, Freedom Summer, unfold, right? 1964, hundreds of volunteers, mostly young people, a lot of them white college students, they head down to Mississippi.
Yeah, Mississippi, the heart of the Deep South, a place where resistance to integration ran deep and where the dangers for Black Americans and those who supported them were very real.
And these volunteers, they knew that going in, right? I mean, this wasn't some casual trip. They were putting themselves on the line for a cause they believed in.
Absolutely. They were risking their lives, literally. And for many of them, it was an act of incredible courage, driven by a deep moral conviction that they couldn't just stand by while others were being denied their basic rights.
And their goal was to register Black voters, right? To help them overcome the intimidation, the literacy tests, all the obstacles that were put in their way.
That was a huge part of it, yes. But it was also about empowering Black communities in a broader sense, about education, about fostering a sense of self-determination.
You're talking about the freedom schools, right? These makeshift schools that were set up across Mississippi during that summer.
Exactly. The freedom schools were amazing. They were a response to the fact that the education system in Mississippi was still deeply segregated and unequal.
So these freedom schools, They provided an alternative, a place where Black students could learn their own history, could explore ideas freely, could find their voice.
Exactly. And the curriculum, it went beyond the traditional subjects. They taught about Black history, about civil rights, about nonviolent resistance. It was about empowering these young people to become agents of change.
Wow. So it wasn't just about giving them the right to vote. It was about giving them the tools, the knowledge, the confidence to exercise that right and to demand their rightful place in society.
Exactly. It was about planting the seeds for long-term change, for a more just and equitable future. And the impact of those freedom schools, it's still felt today.
It's incredible to think about the ripple effect, how this one summer, this concentrated burst of activism, had such a profound and lasting impact.
It really does make you think about the power of collective action, of ordinary people coming together to fight for what they believe in and to challenge a system that had been in place for generations.
But Freedom Summer, it came at a cost, a very high cost.
It did, and we can't talk about Freedom Summer without acknowledging the tragedies that unfolded, the violence, the brutality that these volunteers faced.
The murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, those names are seared into our collective memory, a stark reminder of the risks these young people took.
They were murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan, hunted down simply because they were trying to register Black voters.
It's horrifying, and it sent shockwaves through the nation. I mean, it brought the reality of what was happening in the South into stark relief.
It did, and it forced America to confront its own demons, to acknowledge the deep racial divisions that still existed, and it galvanized public opinion in a way that nothing else had.
Because you couldn't ignore it anymore. It was right there in your face. The brutality, the injustice, it demanded a response.
It did, and it pushed President Johnson and Congress to take even bolder action, which led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
The Voting Rights Act, which finally outlawed those discriminatory voting practices we talked about earlier, the literacy tests, the poll taxes, it was a direct result of the sacrifices made during Freedom Summer.
It was, and it shows how those events, as tragic as they were, helped to move the needle on civil rights, to create the momentum for real and lasting change.
And it's a reminder that progress is often messy, it's often painful, and it requires incredible courage and sacrifice.
Absolutely. And while we celebrate the victories, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, we have to remember that the fight for equality, it's an ongoing process.
It's a fight that continues today. And as we've seen through this deep dive into Freedom Summer, it's a fight that requires us to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice, to never take our rights for granted.
Because the legacy of Freedom Summer, it's not just about the past, it's about the future, it's about the world we want to create for ourselves and for generations to come.
And that's what I hope you take away from this deep dive, that sense of responsibility, that sense of urgency, that understanding that we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world.
Because the spirit of Freedom Summer, that spirit of courage, that spirit of determination, it lives on in all of us, and it's up to us to carry that torch forward.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Freedom Summer and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's been an honor to explore this pivotal chapter in American history with you.
It really has, and let's never forget the lessons learned and the sacrifices made during that incredible summer.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.